This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Ritula Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Tuesday, the 29th of January. Tonight's programme comes from Westminster, where MPs have voted to send Theresa May back to Brussels to negotiate alternative arrangements to replace the Irish backstop in the Brexit plan. They've also sent a message rejecting no deal as an option. So the EU's already responded by saying the withdrawal deal isn't up for reopening or renegotiation. We ask what happens now, and we hear reaction from the government, from Labour and from Dublin and Brussels. So today was the day when Theresa May came back to the Commons and said she wanted to reopen Brexit negotiations in Brussels with, she said, an emphatic message of what MPs want. And this evening, MPs voted on 7 amendments which could influence the direction of Brexit. They rejected options which might have given them a bigger say in the Brexit process and to extend Article 50. However, the Commons also voted against keeping the option of no deal in play, and they voted for the Prime Minister to go back to the EU and ask for the so-called Irish backstop to be replaced by alternative arrangements to avoid a hard border. Well, on tonight's programme, we'll be discussing what this evening's votes mean for Brexit. We'll hear from Dublin, Brussels and Berlin. A little earlier, I took a short walk among the people braving the weather and protesting outside the House of Commons.
Democracy, Trump not Merkel.
It's just after 7 o'clock. MPs are voting on the various amendments in the House of Commons. It's a very different atmosphere from when we were here a couple of weeks ago for the meaningful vote. I think then I described it as almost like a political jamboree. Well, the tents and the TV vans of the Media Village are here, as are the pro and the anti-Brexit demonstrators. But this time, it's raining. It's a little bit miserable. The atmosphere's much more subdued. And I think what that reflects is that tonight, the overriding sense is one of uncertainty. We may get to the end of tonight's votes and so on and possibly be no further forward, or certainly have no clear answer on what the direction of Brexit is going to be. Well, that was earlier this evening in the Commons. Theresa May said after those votes that she now had a mandate from Parliament to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement with the European Union.
Tonight, a majority of honourable members have said they would support a deal with changes to the backstop, combined with measures to address concerns over Parliament's role in the negotiation of the future relationship and commitments on workers' rights in law where need be. It is now clear that there is a route that can secure a substantial and sustainable majority in this House for leaving the EU with a deal.
Well, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who'd previously rejected an invitation from the Prime Minister to attend cross-party talks on the withdrawal agreement until she ruled out a no-deal Brexit. But today, he changed his mind.
Since we've had this debate and the House has emphatically voted to reject the no-deal option that the Prime Minister was supporting, could I say that we are prepared to meet her, to put forward the points of view from the Labour Party of the kind of agreement we want with the European Union to protect jobs, to protect living standards and to protect rights and conditions in this country.
Well, our very own Carolyn Quinn's been watching the day's events from inside the House of Commons, and she's in the lobby of the House now. Carolyn, 7 amendments were up today, only 2 were accepted. What's the Commons decided?
Well, it boils down to just a couple of amendments. The Brady Amendment, first of all, supported by the government, which succeeded by a majority of 16 after some heavy whipping, it has to be said. I overheard one wavering Tory being begged to vote for it. Now, it calls for alternative arrangements to be put in place to replace the backstop plan to avoid a hard border in Ireland. But, you know, some of the hardline Eurosceptics were arguing that the only thing that would get them on board with any government plan was an agreement by the Prime Minister to go back to Brussels and try to reopen the withdrawal agreement and get the backstop removed completely, or some written guarantees provided. So that's where something called the Malthouse Compromise comes in, and it linked up with the Brady Amendment, basically bringing 2 wings of the party together. Some people like Jacob Rees-Mogg from the European Research Group, the Eurosceptic group, and soft Brexit supporters like Nicky Morgan. And they cooked up this alternative plan that Theresa May could use in talks with the EU, perhaps suggesting that the UK stay in transition for an extra year to the end of 2021. And then, if you can't find a solution to the Irish border, then the UK would leave the EU and operate on WTO terms. So that got through, but also getting through was one of Mrs May's strongest negotiating weapons basically ripped from her hands, because Dame Caroline Spelman, a former Tory cabinet minister, and Labour frontbencher Jack Dromey teamed together. They've been working for weeks on a plan to get an amendment to rule out a no-deal Brexit. And they got their non-binding no-deal Brexit amendment through by 8 votes. So it's not legally binding on the government, but it does impose massive political pressure on the Prime Minister. A political point has been made with these 2 amendments.
And Carolyn, at the outset of this afternoon's proceedings, Theresa May said that she wanted a clear mandate to take back to Brussels for a renegotiation. Is that what she has now?
Well, look, she's effectively bought herself another 2 weeks. It's given her some time and space to try to keep her deal alive. I said to a pro-Brexit minister that despite tonight's vote, there is no way that the EU will reopen the withdrawal agreement. They've been repeating that again tonight. But he said, well, look, the EU can't keep saying no to everything. At least with this, she can go to them and say, well, finally, I have a majority for something and agreement across various wings of the party. So consider it. But from the Labour side, there's an awful lot of scepticism. One serious figure said, look, the dead horse is just going to be flogged a bit more. She'll get nothing. And then, actually, Rita, whatever happens, Theresa May will come back to the Commons again for another run at her deal on the 13th, 14th of February after she's had talks in Brussels. And that will provide another chance for MPs to put down more amendments, perhaps the Cooper amendment calling for an extension to the negotiating period and a delay to the UK departure date might be revived. Maybe the Norway Plus idea could be revived. So basically, it's a holding pattern. She's bought herself some time, but who knows? It may be that she's back with a deal that, again, the ERG refuse to accept if they think that the EU have ignored them.
Carolyn Quinn, I suspect we'll be back here chatting on the 13th of February. Look forward to it. So is this a good night for the government? Well, just after the votes took place, I spoke to Liz Truss, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Did she think that the lesson of tonight is that no deal is apparently off the table? And does that bind Theresa May's negotiating hand?
I think the lesson from tonight is that we now have a Brexit plan that commands the support of Parliament. I think the Brady Amendment was the most significant point tonight, which is that people want to see the deal, but with changes to the backstop. And in fact, we didn't see the Cooper Amendment passed, which would have led to a path of no Brexit or delaying Brexit.
But Theresa May acknowledged the Spelman Amendment, and there's so many names and so many amendments to conjure with, which was non-binding but called for no deal to be taken off the table, was something that she would take seriously.
Well, none of us want no deal. What we want is a deal with the EU, and that's what they want too. And what we've been hearing for weeks is there's no proposition that will satisfy the Commons. And what we saw today, for the first time, is exactly what proposition would satisfy the Commons. So from my point of view, the ball is very much now in the EU's court.
But the problem with this proposition is that the EU has repeatedly said that it's not willing to open up the legally binding withdrawal agreement. They've said it tonight within moments of this amendment passing. Why do you think they'll change their mind now?
Well, they would say that anyway, wouldn't they? But, they're good negotiators. I don't deny that for a minute. But the fact is, Parliament has spoken. The EU have been saying for weeks that they wanted to understand what the position of the House of Commons is. They now understand that. And I want to see some flexibility from the EU because it's in everybody's interest. We talked about no deal. Nobody wants no deal, not the UK, not the EU. These are issues that are limited to one part of the withdrawal agreement, the backstop. I think that the changes that we're proposing, there are a variety of ways of achieving that.
Let's talk about the changes, because the amendment talks about alternative arrangements for the backstop. What are those alternative arrangements?
Well, there are various alternative arrangements proposed. For example, changes with technology. There's also the proposal of time limiting the backstop that the Prime Minister mentioned when she opened today's debate.
All of which have been
There's
rejected
also the
previously
proposal,
by the EU.
There's also a proposal of the unilateral exit mechanism as well. Well, what we need to do now is go back to the EU, seek changes. There have been positive noises from various European actors over the last few weeks
about give you lots of negative ones.
I'm sure you can.
I've got a list here.
But there are also positive voices saying we do need to be more flexible. And I think these negotiations, in my view, are always going to go to the wire. That's what tends to happen with EU negotiations.
But what's curious
and we all
about
have to be flexible.
This evening is that Theresa May said what she herself previously, not that long ago, had said was impossible. She'd said that she couldn't reopen the divorce deal, and now that's exactly what she's done. Why? She said herself, this is a legal text that was negotiated over 2 years with 27 other countries. What made her change her mind? Is it that in the end, it's the ERG, the European Research Group, the hardcore Brexiteers, who are really in charge of this process and in charge of the PM?
Well, what made the Prime Minister change her mind was the fact that we were defeated by 230 votes 2 weeks ago. So we had to think again about what we needed to do to ensure the deal commanded the support of the House of Commons. So the thing that commands the support is getting those changes to the backstop. We're now looking for the EU to be flexible. It's in everybody's interest to get this deal. It's always been clear that the backstop ought to be a temporary arrangement. The question is, can we get that into the text of the withdrawal agreement? I think we absolutely should seek to do that.
One last question then. The European Research Group, who were crucial to this amendment passing again today, it's given, in a sense, 2 more weeks for Theresa May to renegotiate a deal. If it gets knocked back, then essentially it could, as you've suggested, be Brussels' fault. But has there been any commitment from the ERG that they will support whatever Theresa May bring back from Brussels? They're not guaranteeing their support, are they? They're just simply saying, we're supporting this tonight, but it kind of depends what we get back.
Well, clearly we need to engage Parliament. But today was a huge step forward. If you think where we were 2 weeks ago, losing a vote by 230, we've now successfully won an amendment on
an amendment. And if you look at the voting on all the other amendments, you saw Parliament was pretty divided. There weren't huge majorities either way.
Well, Parliament was very clear that it didn't support the Cooper or Grieve amendment, which would have essentially torn up the parliamentary rules and undermined the executive. Parliament was very clear it wasn't accepting that. So I think there had been a strong message sent from Parliament. People were claiming that there wasn't a majority in favour of any proposition. There is now clearly a majority in favour of the Prime Minister's deal with a modification to the backstop, and that is progress.
An upbeat Liz Truss there. Well, today's events have revolved around the Irish backstop, that guarantee post-Brexit to avoid a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in the withdrawal agreement. The Brady Amendment, and I can't say this enough times, which has been passed by MPs, calls for the backstop to be replaced with alternative arrangements to avoid a hard border. So this is what Theresa May will take back to Brussels as the basis for a renegotiation. Let's hear some reaction to that. Senator Neil Richmond is a spokesman on European affairs for Fine Gael, Ireland's governing party, and he's also chair of the Brexit Committee. Heidi Hautala is a Green MEP from Finland and a vice president of the European Parliament. Good evening to you both. Neil Richmond, first of all, tonight's votes have shown that Theresa May's deal could make it through Parliament with changes to the backstop. Will the EU be willing to budge on that now?
No. Quite firmly. Firstly, this isn't Theresa May's deal. The withdrawal agreement is the product of over 18 months of tortuous negotiations between the European Union and the United Kingdom, involving quite a bit of concessions on both sides to provide something that gives us a way to have a managed, orderly Brexit. The backstop is a vitally important component of that withdrawal agreement. We said it quite clearly. The negotiations have ended. They ended in November. The withdrawal agreement is as is. And the notion that you can replace a very clear definition in the backstop of what would happen in the worst case scenario with alternative arrangements of which there is no detail of any, or indeed there's no examples of any in existence, is a little bit far-fetched at this stage.
But as Liz Truss was saying there, one of the messages that the EU has sent repeatedly to Theresa May, to the Westminster Parliament, is tell us what you do want. And that is what they've done this evening, isn't it?
Well, kind of. We've asked Westminster to tell us what they do want, but also to ask them to be cognizant of what we on the European side can accept. And we can't accept a
Oh, I think we've lost Senator Neil Richmond there. We'll come back to Neil Richmond in a moment. Heidi Hautala, clearly there's clear resistance there from Neil Richmond, but do you think amongst other EU countries there might be a greater fear of a no-deal Brexit and therefore a willingness to rethink the withdrawal deal and rethink the question of the backstop?
Well, good evening. I believe that what we have heard from the Prime Minister's side now is wishful thinking, and it's very hard to understand why the message from Brussels has not been clearly heard. President Juncker of the European Commission already at the end of last week said that the alternative arrangement to the backstop is a permanent membership in the customs union. And this, I understand, is a no-go for a large part of the House of Commons and the Brexiteers. So really, I think what this all amounts to is playing with precious time. The clock is ticking. And for both sides, I think this is really very torturous indeed. But I would say wishful thinking does not help here. And the EU, with its 27 member states and the Parliament, has been surprisingly united throughout the negotiations. And I don't see any change in that.
The EU27, the Parliament may have been united, but on the other hand, the EU has a long track record of taking negotiations up to the wire and actually finding ways round things. Surely this is an example where Westminster Parliament is going to come back and said, look, this is what we need to make this deal work. At stake is no deal Brexit and all the economic costs that implies. Isn't this the moment at which the EU will say, OK, if this is what it takes to get this deal through and to make it work, actually, this could be it?
I don't really think so, because indeed this is a question of avoiding a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and I believe President Juncker is right when he says that the only alternative solution that is in sight is a permanent membership in the customs union. So I think this is a message that should have been heard. There are others who have repeated similar messages. I think tonight President Macron has repeated that the negotiations are over. That's the best offer that can be given. So I think it's really gambling to play with time in this way.
Senator Neil Richmond, I think you're back on the line. If the alternative to some kind of tweaking is a no deal, will that still be all right for the Republic of Ireland? Isn't that something that will concern Irish businesses and the Irish government?
We in Ireland are most concerned about a no-deal scenario amongst any of the EU remaining 27. Our first Brexit preparedness meeting took place in December 2014. We've already published the legislation and we have already made the arrangements that if we need to move our contingency plans into action, we will. But we really hope that we don't have to, and we see no need, because what we have on offer is a deal agreed by both parties involving many compromises.
A deal that can't pass through the House of Commons, though.
Well, this is the big thing. This isn't solely about Westminster negotiating with itself. Brexit isn't just an issue for the British Parliament. It's not our fault that the British Parliament can't decide on one thing. The British government made a legal commitment to the European Council. We now expect them to see through that, and we will, of course, when we move on to the future relationship, make sure that the best, closest possible relationship between the UK and the EU as a whole is put in place to make sure that this backstop never comes into force. But it absolutely, simply must be there to protect the peace.
Senator Neil Richmond and Heidi Hautala, thank you very much. Well, let's take the temperature here in Westminster. It's pretty cold in this tent. Our panel is sitting with me. Nikki DaCosta is a former Director of Legislative Affairs at Number 10. Paul Waugh is the Executive Editor of Politics at HuffPost UK. And Tanit Koch is a journalist and former editor of the German tabloid Bild, and she joins us from Berlin. Good evening to you all. That was pretty clear what you were hearing there from Ireland and indeed from Finland. Nikki DaCosta, what lesson would you take away from this? Let's talk about Westminster for a moment. What do you think we learnt from today's events in Westminster about the mood here?
I draw out three things. The first of all, that you still see that within the Conservative Party there's a will to come together to find compromise in a quite extraordinary way in terms of what emerged over the night with Remain and Leave MPs working together on this compromise. I think the second thing you learned was that actually party lines are breaking down. For the first time you're actually seeing quite a significant number of Labour MPs versus what we've seen before, where it's usually been about 3 or 4 voting in the government lobby to back delivery on Brexit. I think the third thing that you've learned is that we've really got only 2 weeks in play. And from the interviews that you've just heard, I think there is a great risk, and we always worried about any deadlines in the legislation because there was always a risk that the EU would look to run down that clock. So potentially they're thinking, we just got to hold on another 2 weeks and time this out.
Paul Waugh, is another lesson of tonight that perhaps the ERG remains much more in control of events than people might have expected, and actually Remainers in the House of Commons can't agree on anything?
Well, there's an element of truth in that. It's certainly the case that I think one of the lessons tonight is a simple, old-fashioned one, which is that parties that are united win, parties that are disunited lose. As simple as that. Tonight, what you saw in all those votes was that the Tories got their act together. They rediscovered this gift of unity that they've not had for a long time. Whereas Labour, finally, you saw lots of Labour MPs in Leave areas who thought, actually, they can't let down their working-class voters who voted Leave. And they felt, no way can we be tarred with the idea of any way of delaying Brexit. So they put their cards on the table finally. That was key. But at the end of the day, the PM said tonight she had a substantial and sustainable majority. Substantial, 16 votes? Well, you could get away with that. In a hung parliament, that might be substantial. Whether it's sustainable is completely really undecided, mainly because the ERG have put her on notice that what she's seeking in Brussels may not actually materialise. And
there's no guarantee that they'll support what she comes back with.
Yeah, it's absolutely conditional, their support. And so we could be back again in 2 weeks' time in exactly the same sort of Groundhog May scenario where actually we're rerunning the tape and we could get a different set of results tonight, particularly if government ministers decide no deal is such a threat, they back Yvette Cooper's amendment.
Tanit Koch, that's the close-up view, if you like. You're watching from Berlin. What do you make of it all?
Well, I wish I could say I see a silver lining, but I'm afraid it's still a terrible mess from a European perspective, because both from the Brussels and Berlin view, there is a deal that has been sort of secured by the 27 and that the British government has committed to. And despite the fact that for the first time Parliament has actually decided to be in favour of something, the trouble is that what they're in favour of goes directly against what Donald Tusk and pretty much everybody in the EU have said, that deal is not to be renegotiated.
But how much do you think the risk of no deal is on people's minds?
Well, increasingly so, luckily. So for the last 18 months, I'm afraid Brexit really hasn't been on top of the agenda, neither in Germany nor very much so in many other European countries. And looking at the German situation in particular, which is a big export nation, of course, Britain is a huge market and they're very close commercial links. The unrest amongst the businesses in Germany is growing by the day. So everybody really does not want and increasingly does want to avoid a no-deal Brexit, but people are preparing for it. And in the end, looking at the sort of the sentiment here is that Britain is extremely unstable, and that generally that instability should not take over in Europe. So everybody actually thinks, or most people think, that everything should be done to sort of increase European stability at whatever cost it takes.
Tanit Koch, Paul Waugh and Nikki DaCosta, thank you very much for now. We will return to you, but let's turn to Richard Bergen, the Shadow Justice Secretary, who's just come into the tent. It's relatively warm. I hope you're pleased about that.
Lovely.
It's a mud bath out there. This was a really rather bad night for Labour Brexit policy, wasn't it? It was a disunited party. You finally decided to back the Cooper Amendment. It didn't win. Where does that leave Labour policy?
Well, it was certainly very disappointing that Yvette Cooper's amendment didn't win, despite over 90% of Labour MPs voting for it. And
Quite
of course,
a few Labour MPs voted with the government.
Yeah, well, over 90% of Labour MPs voted for it. 90% of Conservative MPs voted against it. But it's not been a good night for the government either. I think it's testimony to how badly the government's been doing recently, that they're trying to persuade people that tonight was some kind of roaring success. Parliament, very importantly, made clear that a no-deal Brexit is viewed as being disaster and wouldn't be acceptable to
Parliament
Parliament.
were rather tentative on that, weren't they? They sort of said, yes, we don't like a no-deal Brexit, but we're only going to vote for a legally non-binding amendment. We're not going to take control of that process.
Well, I think there's a clear message to the Prime Minister. If she hasn't had the message before, she should certainly take it on board now. And all the Prime Minister's succeeded doing tonight, really, is securing a temporary truce within the Conservative Party, which in 2 weeks' time may be up in smoke again.
So let's talk about Labour policy then.
Yes.
Where does this... Jeremy Corbyn said he's prepared to meet the PM because he says he thinks no deal is now off the table. What can you talk about? And actually, isn't the real alternative for Labour now to get behind a second referendum, something that you've been very reluctant to do?
Well, we haven't ruled out getting behind a second
referendum. So is that what you'll do now?
At some point in the future. We're not there yet. Our priority in terms of negotiating a Brexit deal is to push forward the deal that we've been advocating since day one.
But if there was no majority for a number of those other amendments that we saw tonight, there really isn't a majority for a customs union, is there, in the House of Commons?
Well, the Prime Minister has got to stop negotiating with her own party and start negotiating the national interest for what I would call a traditional British compromise to bring people together. I think that if she pushes Labour's three-point plan, including a permanent customs union, then she's got every chance of getting that through the House of Commons and bringing people who voted leave and those who voted remain out in the country together.
But let's just talk about the simple political lessons of tonight. The Conservative Party, which, on other occasions we talk about the divisions within the Conservative Party, we've talked about the ERG being like a party within a party, actually united, roughly speaking, over certain issues, and they got their amendment through. The Prime Minister got her amendment through. Labour, on the other hand, decided to back the Cooper amendment at the very last minute and actually didn't succeed. Jeremy Corbyn's amendment was voted down by an even larger margin than another by Dominic Grieve. You're disunited. You're not all on the same page.
Well, I think, as I say, over 90% of Labour MPs voted for Yvette Cooper's amendment. The fact that some people took a different view from myself and others is no surprise.
So is the message that you need to shift your Brexit policy now?
No, I think we've got the correct policy on Brexit to be pushing for this compromise which respects and accepts the outcome of the referendum but offers a way forward that can protect jobs and the economy.
But what's the evidence that anyone is going to back the Labour policy in this House of Commons, which is for a customs union?
Well, if people want to get out of this deadlock, this impasse that the Prime Minister has caused by negotiating with their own party for the last 2.5 years, then Labour's policy, including trying to negotiate a permanent customs union, can have a way forward, because Brussels has already indicated that were the Prime Minister to drop some of her red lines and argue for a permanent customs union, then they'd certainly be interested in having meaningful discussions about that.
And just in a word then, a second referendum, is that likely to be Labour's policy going forward?
Well, it's our policy to keep it as an option, but we're not there yet.
Richard Bergen, thank you very much. Well, this evening, the Irish government issued a statement reiterating their stance that the UK's Brexit withdrawal agreement isn't open for renegotiation. And the country's Europe Minister, Helen McEntee, said it was, to quote her, exasperating. Speaking to RTE, she said this is a deal which was negotiated with the UK, by the UK, signed off by the UK and the Prime Minister. And now it looks as though this evening, essentially, there is a rowback and a reneging on the commitments that were made. Well, for more on The View from Dublin, we can hear from our reporter Paul Moss, who's there.
The main bar at Boswell's Hotel is traditionally a place of political intrigue. We're just across the road here from the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. Generations of MPs have come to this old-fashioned wood-panelled drinking hole to plan, to plot, and sometimes just to discuss the issues of the day by means of a drink rather than a formal debate. And this evening's no different, except that I'm here to talk about the political machinations across the water in Britain's Parliament, specifically Brexit, and how that ongoing saga is affecting this country, the Republic of Ireland. And to do that, I'm joined by the renowned Irish journalist and broadcaster Audrey Carville, and also by Verona Murphy, who's president of this country's Road Haulage Association and herself runs a road haulage business. As we get towards the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, how worried are you?
I'm very concerned, and our members are very concerned. There's actually no framework in which we can continue post-Brexit. We're not at the stage of panic. We believe that we have sufficiently advised the Irish government for the past 2.5 years since Brexit occurred on what the options would be.
But given that Britain says it's not going to accept the backstop and the Brady Amendment's just gone through, would you like to see your government compromise a bit in order to get a deal? Perhaps offer some kind of time limit to the backstop, maybe say like a 10-year limit?
From our perspective, no, because we'd be well aware that where does the compromise end? And I think that's something that Britain needs to learn. There has been 2.5 years of steadfast Irish government and EU politicians saying there will be no renegotiating of the backstop.
Audrey Carville, if I can bring you in. There is this principled stand by the Irish. They've said again and again, no renegotiation. But as it gets closer, as people like Verona are going to see their businesses affected, is there any political pressure on the Irish government to budge, to compromise?
Many of us think there must be. Surely the public positions cannot match the private positions of people like Verona and so many other farmers, exporters, business people. But speaking to various business people over the last few days, there is no pressure coming on the Irish government from within this island to change their position on the backstop. They are absolutely in full support of the Irish government. It's very interesting. The only other time I can remember such unity on an issue in this country is the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, speaking of the Good Friday Agreement, plenty of people have said that a no-deal Brexit threatens that. Again, some people have suggested this is just bluff and no one's really worried. Do you think people here are worried about the future of the peace process, about the Good Friday Agreement?
Without a shadow of a doubt. I come from a border county myself, the border county of Monaghan. So I know what it's like to have lived in a border with border apparatus there. And speaking to people on both sides of the border, that is their biggest fear, a return to violence.
Can I ask you something, Verona? Given what Audrey's just said about the fear of a return to violence, given what you've said about the fears for your business, do you feel any hostility towards Britain? Do you feel angry about Brexit?
No, I'm not angry. I believe that it is the right of the British citizens to make their decision, but I think that decision should be made based on informed decision making. There was a lot of propaganda before the referendum, misinformation. It's still going.
Has it changed attitudes generally to Britain here in Ireland, Audrey?
Many people here have always looked to the United Kingdom and regarded it as a country that knows what it's doing. And yet for the past 2.5 years in particular, particularly in the last year, we have looked, I suppose, in horror and bewilderment as your country's politicians have devoured themselves from within. So I think a lot of people here sit and wonder what is going on.
One thing that's going on is an awful lot of Brits have started applying for Irish passports. I saw a piece in a newspaper, an Irish newspaper, saying that some post offices here have run out of application forms. How do you feel about that? That so many British people suddenly discover their grandmother was born in Limerick and want to be Irish, or at least have an Irish passport?
Paul, it just underpins the closeness of our relationship. I mean, we've got generations of Irish fathers who travelled to the UK and supported their Irish families from the work in the UK. We depend greatly on the UK and will continue to do so, whether there's a Brexit or not.
Verona Murphy, Audrey Carville, thank you both very much.
Paul Moss in Dublin there. Well, let's go back to our panel. Nikki DaCosta, former Director of Legislative Affairs at Number 10, and Paul Waugh, Executive Editor of Politics at HuffPost UK. Is Theresa May's deal back on track, Nikki DaCosta?
Having, being involved in these kind of battles over the last year, you take what ground you can gain, inch by inch. So, right now you think, okay, well, we've won 2 weeks. Let's see what you can do with that. And, there are anecdotes not terribly helpful here, but there were, times when you thought this is the worst it's ever going to get, and then you survive them and you move forward. So, look, I don't really know. I don't know how the EU bit pans out, but what I can say is right now there'll be a lift of mood. You can often do a lot with that.
Paul Waugh.
Well, Nikki deserves some credit, actually, because 3 weeks ago she was on a HuffPost podcast and predicted tonight's outcome, effectively. She said there would be some kind of backbent amendment that people could rally round, and the government could then take to the EU to say, look, at least we've got something. But the thing I think is really interesting about tonight is that actually the Prime Minister said she's got a mandate from the Brady Amendment to go back to Brussels and unpick the backstop. But she didn't say she's got a mandate to rule out no deal, even though there was a vote tonight that effectively mandated her on non-binding sense, but so is the Brady non-binding, to rule out no deal. And yet that's the point of decision she's going to have to come to in 2 weeks' time. Does she really, really countenance a no deal? Will she be remembered as a Prime Minister who took us into a no-deal Brexit? I'm not sure she is that kind of Prime Minister. There's obvious advantages from tonight why she should do that. She'd keep her party together, to keep the DUP on board. But does she actually brave possible cabinet resignations over it? Can she weather them? You could say she could. She's weathered a lot in the last year. But that's the crunch call she's got to make. She hasn't made it yet.
In which case, Nikki DaCosta, was tonight as much about party unity as what happens over Brexit?
I think so. Definitely on the party unity front. But what you saw is, what's notable is you watch for those names that come up time and time again. And if you think about it, you've got Nicky Morgan and Stephen Hammond associated with this. They've rebelled previously. You've got on the Brexit side Steve Baker and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And then in the mix, you've got Robert Buckland, who's been sort of the bridging minister through many of these battles. So this is an extraordinary united thing. Usually it's a number 10 put up, whereby we persuade Remainers and Leavers to add their names. This was genuinely them coming together on their own bat, keeping it quiet.
Well, there were plenty of people speculating that Number 10 had sort of sanctioned it in some sense.
My understanding is no. I mean, yes, they're aware of the conversations, but this is something that's come from them, and that's quite extraordinary and suggests how deeply MPs feel their affinity for the party.
Paul, where does this leave Labour? I was trying to sort of tease Richard Bergen tease out whether this does mean a move to a second referendum is perhaps almost inevitable for Labour as a position.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, because what we saw tonight was precisely the difficulties Corbyn faced if he does go towards a second referendum. You've got a lot of MPs in Leave seats who really won't want to wear that. And just as importantly, there's only one party tonight disciplining its MPs, front benchers, for defying the whip, and it's Labour. It's not the Conservatives. As I understand it, there's going to be several front benchers who abstain tonight who may well be disciplined. So, you're in an interesting position for Labour. Again, just as May's got to come to a hard decision about whether or not she really backs no deal, Jeremy Corbyn's really got to come out and say whether or not actually ultimately a second referendum is the ultimate insurance policy that his members want and whether he'll deliver it. I personally think that's looking a bit unlikely after tonight.
The Brady Amendment emerged from something called the Malthouse Compromise. Is there much evidence of real compromise this evening?
Well, you could say within the Tory party there certainly is. I think Nicky's right. The divide has been tried to be bridged by these junior ministers and MPs. Of course, the big problem with that is, as the EU will tell you, it's just yet more chasing unicorns. They think it's fancy politics. They think it's ever going to get off the ground. A lot of the things in this so-called Malthouse Compromise have been ruled out by the EU already. However, Number 10 keep telling us, look, that's all priced in. The EU are bound to say no, but there are some messages that could be compromised.
10 seconds, Nikki DaCosta.
In Malthouse Compromise, it's worth just noting there was quite a lot of movement from the Brexiteers to what they'll accept. There was a tiny little thing that nobody noted about Bill Cash's intervention on the PM, which was a technical point about accepting to some degree, as long as there's a limit on sort of the continuation of the ECA and IP. So that's a lot of jargon there. But essentially, I think there's a lot of compromise hidden.
We shall see. Thank you very much to Nikki DaCosta and Paul Waugh. That's The World Tonight. I'm Ritha Lashar. For now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night.